right here at the edge of Key West, Florida, a place that is extremely significant to the historical topic I'm going to discuss, is an old abandoned hangar area, which, with its exact purpose unknown, at least at this point, is an example of a site that is extremely relevant to the 1962 conflict of the Cuban Missile Crisis, an example of heightened tensions between the communist superpowers and the capitalist superpowers during the general conflict that represented this period known as the Cold War. Basically, this plane right here, while all the details are generally unknown to me, basically had its roots about 20 and 25 years ago when Cuban refugees actually flew it into the area after they had hijacked it and tried to come in. Now, they were arrested and essentially received long jail time for this, but this plane is still an example of major historical transcendence, especially when it came to two different cultures coming in, that was relevant to the future time period created by the conflict of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, essentially, the Cuban Missile Crisis is a conflict that's often talked about, often used in various different references and analogies, and almost portrayed as this extremely scary climax of American conflict in which the actual stability of the Western world, the free world, the United States, and just general global stability was actually at a threat. And while much of that is true, there are many aspects of it that are more interesting and relevant to specific topics than is often discussed. Specifically, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a 1962 conflict which really was really majorly relevant towards the end of 1962, in October and November of that year, in which basically the island country of Cuba, the closest communist nation to the United States, and at the time, and really still today, one of the major communist superpowers of the globe, essentially was receiving huge amounts of military artillery, specifically nuclear and non-nuclear missiles, from the leading communist superpower of the globe, the Soviet Union, whom they were trading with. Now, this greatly scared not just the government of the United States, but also the people of the United States and many citizens of the free world overall, as this showed that now an at odds with the Western world, and specifically at odds with the United States country, Cuba, had major military technology that could enable them, with really one push of a button, to almost destroy the entire security apparatus of the United States, as essentially they had missiles that could actually reach Washington, D.C. and almost destroy much of the major governmental areas there, really destabilizing the U.S. Now, the real question is, why did the Cubans receive and wish to have and possess such opposing threat? Well, really the real reason at the heart of it was because the year before and earlier in that year, there had been a strongly U.S.-supported and even U.S.-backed rebellion, you could say, between the Cuban exiles, who had essentially been exiled from Cuba as they were considered enemies of the Castro government, as the communist leader Fidel Castro had ascended to power as the dictator, or as they referred to him, president of Cuba a few years earlier in 1959. And essentially, the U.S. trained many exiles in the area to actually launch a major coup d'etat to overthrow Castro and reinstate the capitalist, or as some people might call it, the right-wing government in Cuba, or at least create a new government that was anti-Castro. Now, there are various different reasons as to why this kind of rebellion was supported, specifically by the Kennedy administration and the United States and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. But the crux of the reasoning is most likely because Fidel Castro, not only was he, of course, a major communist power so close to the United States, which was considered the bastion of the capitalist free world, but essentially he had been dismantling and redistributing the wealth and influence of U.S. companies that were basically that had headquarters and had stations in Cuba and were taking many of the resources and shipping it to the United States and using it for their own profit, whether it be banana companies, grain, agriculture, even some forms of oil and mineral and resource extraction around the borders of Cuba, in the waters near Cuba, the Matanzas Bay, where there's a stretch of water between the US and Cuba, and various other economic reasons that US entities had interest in attaining, and that Fidel Castro had basically used to kind of provide more to his country. So the US was not too happy about that, and in general, a country that was trading with the Soviet Union, the leading competitive superpower on the globe, was a general threat to the US that they were kind of becoming less keen about. As before, when Fidel Castro and his administration first came to power, they were actually supported, at least in name, by the United States, as publicly they weren't exactly against a new leader coming to power who initially didn't even call himself a communist, as Fidel Castro didn't even use the term or really even embrace the concept until around 1961, at least not publicly, or at least in the perception of the Western media. Now, because of the US supported coup of Castro, obviously Castro now felt threatened and wanted to make sure that the US had a real reason not to intervene in Cuban affairs. And the real way to do this was in late 1962 to receive major military support and technologies from their leading ally and the US's one real superpower that they had major fear of, or at least were in major competition with, the Soviet Union. Now, what was interesting about the missile crisis was that Fidel Castro could have just received general military support from the Soviet Union and showed that he was actually creating a strong, simple security force, or at least a strong military bastion in which he could actually create almost a general fortress country that could actually show real military aggression towards the United States. But that really wasn't Castro and Cuba's main idea. What their purpose was just to receive the technologies of which they could defend themselves, or at least show that they had military dominance, to de-incentivize any kind of invasion or simple interference in Cuban affairs on behalf of the US government and any other powerful nation. Now, while the US media and Western corporations, citizens, people, even just neighbors in their communities essentially talked about this and really feared for their own well-being during this brief time, it really was not that climactic of an event during the Cold War, as there were other periods in which there were also high points of conflict, such as the proxy wars, in which capitalism and communism really fought on the ground in Korea, in Vietnam, later in Afghanistan, and various different conflicts, which represented the overall greater conflict of the Soviet Union communism versus the US-style capitalism, or at least different derivations of that. Now, the conflict officially came to a close towards the end of 1962 after really only a month and a half of major aggression between Cuba and the United States ideologically, when Cuba, basically agreeing they didn't want to have any major conflict, decided that they were going to cease taking any more weaponry and missile capabilities from the Soviet Union, especially when the Soviet Union decided that they really didn't want to be part in this conflict between Cuba and the US, as John F. Kennedy was able to make sort of, you could say, a détente with Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union. At this point also, the US decided to take extreme measures, or at least extreme measures at the time, and place an embargo on Cuba. Or basically, they decided to cease all major trade with Cuba and really end their embassy and end real diplomatic ties to the nation. And by doing this, they basically kind of allowed Cuba to be isolated, but not to have any kind of real threat. So as you can see, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a really relevant and interesting part of history as an example of how power and fear can really impact two nations, and how it's important to really look at the overall conflict, look at many different sides to a problem, and understand what truly the best solution is to ending any kind of major aggression or hostility between any major powers.